Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. As always, this is your captain, Randy Wright speaking, and I'd like to take this opportunity to personally thank you for choosing to fly over the friendly airwaves with us here on our state-of-the-art radio program, Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer. Well, folks, without any further ado, let's go ahead and delve into the topic that I have selected for today's show. There is some mask mandate backlashes that are going on in the Show Me state of Missouri. And this is something I have a feeling we're going to see a fair amount of with respect to the Show Me state. Partly because it is something that has just been continuing to develop, and you've got a bunch of school boards that are just ignoring the decisions that have been made by the appellate courts that essentially, were enjoining the enforcement of these mask mandates. And of course, we know that there has always been, at least for well over a year now, anger over the mask mandates. And it's very true when it comes to schools. And here's where it gets interesting, because in Missouri, their attorney general is suing some 36 school districts within this state for imposing mask mandates on students. Now, Attorney General Eric Schmidt has released a statement in which he said mask mandates in school are illegal. They simply don't work, and they contribute to alarming and negative psychological impacts on our children. And indeed, there have been concerns over mask mandates as well as remote learning, and what that has led to with respect to how the kids are developing. I mean, it has led to questions as to whether or not the development of the up-and-coming generations have been unduly harmed and inhibited by such mandates. And there's good reason for these questions. Certainly, one of the reasons that we would ask these sorts of questions is because part of development that is so important for students, particularly in the phases where they're growing up, is learning to express from this part of the face and to recognize the sort of body language that exists with our usual way of communicating, because the vast majority of human communication is through body language as opposed to the sorts of communication that you would have just verbally. And so that's something that we really can't afford to ignore, even though there are a lot of leftists who would have us ignore that. But it's very interesting that the Attorney General would have the response that he did to that. Of course, there are two Missouri statutes which are essentially at the heart of this issue. And these statutes require the school districts to create and enforce policies to ensure the health and safety of the students. Now, I know that in previous episodes, I have discussed the plenary powers of the general police power and the nature of those plenary powers. What I mean by plenary powers is that they are near absolute. And that's exactly what these school districts are relying upon. So, with the general police powers, the states are acting in a way that they believe is in the best interest of their people. But it has led to conflict. In Missouri, the conflict rests on the bases of the county levels of government, so the local levels of government competing with what the state has said. And part of the problem is that a precedent has been established where the governments have been ready, willing, and able to ignore decisions which have been handed down by the appellate courts. And that's certainly the case with the Missouri Court of Appeals, because the Missouri Court of Appeals has already ruled, and in such a way as to prevent at least 2 districts from enforcing the mandates. Despite this, as of December, Schmidt has received some 11,000 messages, email messages, and photographs from people who witness mask requirements still being implemented in public schools. And so this is much like the sort of response Biden has had to his mandates being shot down. So whenever the courts rule against him, or whenever the courts rule against someone on the left, their initial knee-jerk response is essentially to say that they're not going to follow it. They're not going to abide by it. And in other words, they're going to view what the courts are doing as being illegitimate. And that, too, is part of the problem. It's a problem that we can't ignore, because what it does is it undermines the integrity of the court. And it means that there's going to be more and more cases of lawsuits going in front of the courts as more families and students are impacted. But if ever there was a concern that needed to be had right now, it is about the development of students. There are talks from educators all around the country, even from some on the left now, that are starting to say, hey, maybe we need to sit down and have a more thorough conversation and discussion in regards to what sort of unintentional consequences could be falling upon our students right now. Because there have been reports of it demoralizing students, making students feel detached from one another and struggling with learning. If we are inhibiting a generation, that's a terrible thing. In a sense, what we are doing is we are depriving them of their regular development in order to placate certain fears, certain unjustified and unrealistic fears that have essentially gripped people. And as a result, we are jeopardizing the future of these students. And that's not fair. I don't think that that's something we can afford to do. I don't think that's something that we fully comprehend the type of damage that it has done. But we see that the government just doesn't care. But as long as there are people like Attorney General Schmidt who are prepared to do what is necessary and proper in order to stand up for the families and the students, then that's a good thing. Ladies and gentlemen, we are certainly going to have a challenge ahead of us with all of this. There are no easy answers to this because both sides are firmly entrenched. That said, there is only one side that can be right. And that side is the side that follows the rule of law. And the rule of law is set out in the 4 corners of the United States Constitution. After all, it is the supreme law of the land. That is what Article 6, Clause 2, Supremacy Clause states. But we see time and again that we have these politicians, these bureaucrats in particular, that believe that these things don't apply to them. And so they double down whenever their authority is challenged. We saw this with Governor Whitmer in Michigan. We see it in Missouri. We've seen it with people like Clay Jenkins in Dallas County in Texas. These people do not wish to accept the limitations of power and authority that exist within our federalist system of government because they are power hungry. And in many ways, this whole pandemic response has not been about protecting people, per se. On the contrary, it's been about expanding the scope, breadth, and application of power. That is the type of manipulation we're seeing, and it is a dangerous development. And so it is good to see that we have attorney generals in Virginia, in Missouri, in Texas, and in various other states that are standing up to school districts that are essentially operating outside the purview of their authority. And it's also good that we see the federal government being shot down, such as Biden's mass mandate for federal employees being enjoined by a federal court here in Texas. But we already see that the Biden administration is going to appeal that again. And it's going to double down on the narrative that it has been putting forth here this entire time and trying to ignore what the courts have said. That is a dangerous precedent which he has set here. But it is par for the course with Biden. This is because Biden believes that he is above the law. And we can certainly see that by the behavior that has been exhibited by the Biden family. Hunter Biden thinking he's above the law. Joe Biden himself thinking he's above the law. And so that has polluted the entire governmental framework. And it's something that we just cannot ignore because it is getting worse with each passing day. So long as they believe that the rule of law doesn't apply to them, and so long as they create this two-tiered system, our republic is going to continue to face the type of debilitating and destabilizing impacts and effects that we have been seeing since Biden assumed office in January of 2021. It is just one of those things that we can't ignore. So, the courts will have to continue to work as they have been, but we, as a nation and people, need to be more proactive as well. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that we have to be prepared to go forth to the polls at this midterm election and remind them that we will not just sit idly by, that we will not just allow them to have free reign over the system, that the corruption and the violations of our rights that we saw in 2020 will not be repeated. It is the future of this nation that we have to consider. Are we going to allow the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists to redefine who we are and how our government operates? Or are we going to take the necessary and proper stance in order to ensure that our freedoms and liberties are secured? There is no easy answer. I know this, because we are more divided than we have been at any other point within the realm of living memory. And so long as such divisions exist, there is going to be fierce resistance. And we can see that based off of the haughty and arrogant approach that the Biden administration has shown, whether it be through his press secretary, whether it be the way that these leftist groups and organizations and factions throughout the several states attempt to ignore court injunctions or what have you. These things make the fight that we're facing all the more difficult. Yet it also tells us just how important this struggle is. Because they wouldn't be putting up such staunch and fierce resistance if they didn't believe that it was a difficult struggle as well. And when it comes to the future of this nation, I think that's got to be the biggest struggle we have of all. When you look at the preamble to the United States Constitution, it states that we have to basically preserve this constitutional federalist republic for future generations, because that's what they intended for it to do. It is our birthright. It is an inheritance that is to be handed down. Well, that in turn requires that we be proactive with this. So it's in that line of thought that I applaud Eric Schmidt's efforts and the various other attorney generals and other actors who are fighting to preserve our rights and liberties, particularly in the face of such staunch adversity. It is a beacon, a guiding light for us all to follow. With that said, ladies and gentlemen, I want to take this opportunity again to thank you for flying over the friendly airwaves with us here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer. I hope to see you again the next time we set out. Please do take care. We'll see you next time.